But we are going to continue our study through the life of David today. And we're going to talk about the addiction of acceptance. If you remember last week, we're going to pick up right after where David and Goliath were. And we're going to see the fallout and the aftermath of Saul's response. So we're going to kind of look at as much about David as Saul. So there's going to kind of look at the two of them today. We're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 18. When David had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword and his bow and his belt. If you really understand what's going on with King Saul, pay attention to how many times there's a particular word that's going to come up over the next few verses. Now, whenever you're reading something, and this works in the Bible, this works in any literature, whenever the author puts a word in there over and over again, sometimes, if it's not a very good author, it's just redundancy. But if it's someone who knows how they're writing, they are good at writing, they will do that as a literary device to get your attention. They want you to notice that this word is in there over and over again. And that's this next thing that's coming up. I want you to see how many times the word success or successful is used in the next few verses to describe David over the rest of this passage that we're going to go through. So beginning in verse 5, it starts here. David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him. As a result, Saul set him over the army. Now we can look back into last week and we can see how David was loved by Saul. It didn't start out with this contentious relationship here. They actually were very close to one another. David was the one who was called in to play the harp and soothe Saul. And Saul loved David. In fact, he was so impressed with David's abilities that he put him over the army. This young man, he put him over troops, 1,000 people, starting with 1,000 people, because David was accelerated for his age. He had just defeated the giant. There's no way that he could just kind of be pushed off to the side and forgotten. So Saul sees that, and he loves him at this point, and so he begins to care for him. And all the people, even the servants of Saul, approved. This is where things start to change. All the people, even the servants of Saul, approved. It's okay for Saul to notice David, but not for everybody else. He is kind of taking all the headlines away from the king. Saul's own servants begin to notice David. And when that happens, it's okay when you hear the news and you turn on the TV and you hear about Saul because that's what he wanted. But when somebody else starts getting recognition, Saul starts to get a little bit jealous. And they're impressed with David in the way that they used to be impressed with Saul. Verse 6. As they were coming home, when David returned from killing the Philistine, the women came out of all the towns of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with songs of joy, with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they made merry. Saul has killed his thousands, and David his 10,000s. That song that they sang went straight to the top of the charts. I don't know what genre of music that would have been considered. I don't know if that sounds much like a country song or maybe a hard rock song because of all the death associated. But Saul, he may have enjoyed the tune, but he didn't like the lyrics. Saul was angry, verse 8, for this saying displeased him. He said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul eyed David from that day on. Now, when it says that Saul eyed David, it doesn't mean that he just looked at him. I have teenage daughters, and if there are boys that are interested in them, I don't look at those boys. If I were to look at them, it would be like, if I eye them, that's a different look altogether. How you doing, Mr. Cannon? I'm good. How are you? I'm eyeing them. It's different. I'm looking upon them with suspicion. And that's what was happening here. David was being eyed by Saul. You know the difference between looking at someone and giving them the eye. The next day, verse 10, an evil spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre. And he did day by day, or as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul threw the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but he had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. And David marched out and came in leading the army. David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. When Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for it was he who marched out and came in leading them. David was the one who was going out and having success. Everywhere David went, he had success. And I'm convinced that the only thing that Saul could see was David's success. The only thing that he could notice, everywhere David went, he was successful, and that's consuming for Saul. There's nothing else that he's noticing about David. David is there to calm him, and there were times when he did, but that's no longer what Saul is seeing. Saul is only seeing David's successes, and we see that he has a spear in his hand in this passage. There's no indication that he was preparing to kill David that day, but it was an impulse decision. It was, he looked over and he saw him, and he had this evil spirit had come upon him, and he tried to pin him to the wall. It's something based on all that buildup that's been going on in Saul's life. Now, when I think of an impulse decision, I think in terms of what is associated with me, impulse decision, those are the items that they put right by the register at the Publix. So if I'm going through and I'm being good, I'm going through the grocery store, I'm not buying things I don't need, I'm not getting any sugar because I don't need any sugar, and I'm standing there in line and there's someone ahead of me, I look over and what do I see? An impulse decision, Milky Way. And what happened, that is the culmination of the building up of all the food that I've seen in the store that I wanted and I wasn't going to get. And now I have a moment of weakness and I just reach over and I get it and Now, having a candy bar and trying to murder somebody is not the same. But the point being, an impulse decision, this was something that had been building over a long time. There were a lot of little things along the way that made Saul jealous of David. He was getting these songs about him. He was getting all the press. He would turn on the news and they were talking about how this boy was given credit for all the victories when actually it was the king who should have been getting the credit. Everybody he talked to was talking about this. So it was building and building, and now it was coming to fruition. It's not that God was setting things up here for Saul to be the bad guy so that David could have an antagonist. That's not what this is. Early on in Saul's life, he was the people's choice. He was the people's champion. He saw what David was getting, and he remembered when they loved him that way. And he had a difficult time from the very beginning because God had said there was no king, and the people insisted we need to have a king, and so he relented and said, okay, well, I'll let you have what you want. But this popularity is where the problem begins, because Saul gets addicted to the praise of the people early on. He wants that. He thrives on that. I need that attention. His mood is determined whether or not he gets affirmed by the people who serve under him. And it's that addiction to approval and that popularity that it ends up setting King Saul up for a failure. You'd think that after being king for long enough, you'd get used to this kind of treatment, this kind of praise. And, just push it off on somebody else. Let them get credit for the battle this time. I've done this before. I know it, but it's not that way. That's where our humanity gets in the way, because there's never going to be enough affirmation for us. Our flesh desires to be loved. We want to hear someone say, I love you. In our flesh, there's never enough. You can never be told I love you enough times, because we want to have that connection with people. You can never be adequately celebrated, because the very nature of approval is that it satisfies temporarily, and you need more. I need more of this. This addiction, I love the praise of people, and sure, at one point, getting a little bit is good, but now I want more of that. Now I need more of that. And that's the way it works with addiction. It doesn't matter how much the people love Saul. It's never enough to satisfy him. So now David is getting all that attention that Saul used to get, and he can't handle it anymore. So what do I have to do? I have to get rid of the man, the boy, this young guy who's taking all my press. I have to eliminate him. And here's something that we have in common with Saul, more than we would like to admit. See, here's the thing. Saul, when you look through the history of the kings of Israel, Saul was not what we would consider an evil king. Because you look through and see, Saul never tried to turn the hearts of the people away from God. Saul did some selfish things and removed himself from God's blessing. But you've got kings like Ahab and Zedekiah. You've got all these other kings that were actively evil. Everything that they did was to pull people away from God, not only self-serving, but they were instruments of evil. But when you look back through the history of Israel, Saul ranks as one of the better kings as far as his righteousness in the big picture. What we have in common with Saul is that we learn to become dependent on human praise and affirmation to give us worth and value, and that spoils us. I like that. I like the way that they look at me. I like the way that they talk about me. I like the way that they treat me. And if they treat somebody else that way, then they're not looking at me, and I can't have that. That's the attitude of Saul, and whether some people want to admit it or not, that is the fleshly attitude of too many people, even within the house of the Lord. We begin to crave it. I would go so far as to argue that David and Saul were not as polar opposites as a lot of people would try to paint them. See, Saul knew about the presence of God. Saul experienced the presence of God. And it would be completely inaccurate to paint David as the good guy and Saul as the bad guy. Well, don't mess up my theology, preacher. Don't get in there, because David's the good one and Saul's the bad one. It's what I've learned my whole life. We know that David is a man after God's own heart. David is passionately in love with God. But you can't say that one is a good man and the other is a bad man. There are things that David does that are good. There are things that Saul had done that were good. And there are things that David did that were bad. And there were things that Saul did that were bad. So what's the difference between David and Saul? It's about their relationship with God. The difference between David and Saul is that David understood the love of God and Saul did not. David grasped God's love. Saul never quite understood it. It wasn't that one of them was a good guy and the other one was a bad guy. It was that one knew God in a way that the other didn't. David understood a relationship with God in a way that Saul never did. You see, in his formative years, Saul gets thrust into the spotlight. Saul is now king, and he has no example to look at, no godly example. This is their first king, and he's thrust into the spotlight. Here you go. What am I supposed to do? Just follow the leading of the Lord. You got Samuel here who will help you. He'll tell you the word, and you follow it. Okay. But what happened was, because Saul was thrust into the spotlight during those formative years, he began to believe his own press. He began to buy into his own PR. David, like we talked about a couple weeks ago, and I'm going to reference back this message from a couple weeks ago here a few times. David has that season of obscurity in a very important time in his life where he's out in the field, and there's nobody out in the field except him and the sheep and the occasional lion or bear. But David writes his Psalms. A lot of the things that he wrote were written in the time when he was in his field, when it was just him and God, and he had that relationship. So he understood the heart of God because he was in a place where he could be sustained by God, where he could look to God, where the only thing that he had was God, not the praise of people. So David understood the love of God in a way that nobody else in Scripture understood from the time of David until the time of Jesus. Nobody understood the love of God or the heart of God like David until Jesus. And that's because Jesus was God's son, is God's son. Now, I'm not comparing the two morally. Jesus never sinned, not one day in his life. He died the spotless lamb taking on the sins of the world. David sinned a number of times. In fact, David's greatest sin wasn't the murder of Uriah or the adultery with Bathsheba. David's greatest sin that affected the most people was pride. He had a little bit of Saul in him, and he had some pride later on in life, and he wanted to number Israel. I want to know how many people that I have. I want to know how many people are my subjects because I'm the king. And they warned against it. Don't do this. And he said, shut up and do it anyway. And what ended up happening was God gave a choice, and there ended up being a plague that swept through, and thousands of people died because of David's pride. So don't think that David is this perfect person here. When David was good, he was very, very good. But when David was bad, he was very, very bad. But he knew the heart of God, and he would always return to the heart of God. Always. And there's something unique about the connection between David and God and that they experience. You can see that throughout the Psalms that David wrote. This next passage is not going to be on the screen, and you can follow along if you'd like in your own text in Psalm 139, but I'm going to read this out of the New King James Version because I want you to hear the heart of David, who understands the heart of God. For the chief musician, a psalm of David. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know my sitting down, you know my rising up. You understand my thought afar off. You comprehend my path and my lying down. You are acquainted with all my ways, for there is not a word on my tongue, but behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You have hedged me behind and before, and laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain it. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, you are there. And David, because the Psalms are not written chronologically, we don't know when in David's life that this was written. But we do know that David will live long enough to see this psalm come true in his life multiple times. David will flee from God's presence. Where can I go? Again, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? He knows if I'm going to do something and I'm going to hide and I'm going to try to do it in secret, God's going to find out. See, that's one of the differences between David and Saul. Saul tried to hide some things. That's when the disconnect began to happen. They would overtake a nation, and he was told to get rid of everything. All the spoils of war were to be killed. And Saul kept things. He kept some of the things for himself. And when Samuel came up, he said, "What is this?" He said, "Oh, well, I only kept those to give them to God. You know, those aren't for me. Those aren't for our people. That's just so we can give it to God." And Samuel was like, "No, you think you can hide that from God?" But David knew you cannot hide from God's presence. Verse 9, if I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me and shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness will fall on me, even the night shall be light about me. Indeed, the darkness shall not hide from you. But the night shines as day. The darkness and the light are both alike to you. Verse 13, I'm not preaching about this specifically, but if you ever need to know where to go to defend life, and especially to defend those of the unborn who cannot speak for themselves, go to Psalm 139, verse 13. For you formed me, you formed my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb. I don't know how we've gotten to a place where we've devalued life so much. Verse 14, I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. See, there's a big difference between being someone who knows that God delights in them before they were born. David knew. David knew, before you even brought me to this place, you delighted in me. and someone who thinks God delights in their works. That was Saul. If I do all the right things, if I do good, if I do enough good, it'll overdo what I did that was bad. David knew that God loved him simply for existing. There was nothing that David had to do to earn God's love. There was nothing that Saul had to do to earn God's love, but he didn't realize that. David understood that God loved him simply for existing. Verse 15. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Your eyes saw my substance, being yet unformed, and in your book they all were written, the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them. How precious also are your thoughts to me, O God. How great is the sum of them. If you should count them, they would be more in number than the sand. When I awake, I am still with you. God, you think about me so much that if we could number them, they would be as the sands of the sea. That's how great God's thoughts are toward us. And in that last part where it says, when I am awake, I am still with you. A different version of it, the New Revised Standard Version says it this way. I come to the end, I am still with you. David would make it to the end and he would still know of God's love. He would still know that God was with him. From the time that David was young, he knew that God loved him that way. He'd sit around for hours in obscurity thinking about how marvelous it would be that God was always with him, that God was aware of him. When you read the 23rd Psalm, it reads more like a New Testament experience, making God personal. In the Hebrew culture back then, God was corporate. Yet in Psalm 23, David said, the Lord is my shepherd. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. Not corporate. It was a personal relationship between David and God that Saul didn't understand. This is not just about David and Saul. I'm going to bring this into today. This is about you and me. Since we were very young, we've been taught that our value is contingent on what we can do and what we produce. If you work hard and you make good decisions, you will be blessed. Therefore, if you don't work hard and you make poor decisions, you must be a failure. Now, I'm not saying we can be lazy and be blessed. No, there's scriptures throughout the Bible that talk about how we are to work and do the best that we can do. But if we get into that mindset that if I just do more and more good instead of understanding that our actual acceptance needs to come from God. This is about our deep love to be needed and accepted. If we don't get to that place, then we're going to fail in the same way that Saul did. It's true of us just as it was true for Saul. There's never be someone in your life that can say, I love you enough. There will never be someone in your life that can make you feel accepted enough because our flesh craves more. And as long as we are addicted to that affirmation, as long as we get our sense of identity from someone other than God, then we are going to end up on the same path that Saul ended up. No, you may never try to pin someone to the wall with a spear, but that affirmation becomes an addiction all the same. Saul, how addicted was Saul to the approval of others? The night before he died, or early that morning, he went and found a witch. And he went to her and said, I need you to summon up the ghost of Samuel. And she said, no, Saul, put an end to all that. And you're trying to get me killed. Because if I do that, you'll tell the king. He was hidden, so she couldn't understand who he was. And when he finally convinced her to do it, there she summoned up what was probably likely not the actual ghost of Samuel. Samuel was in heaven. But regardless, this image that she summoned up from the dead was something who was in the appearance of Samuel and looked at Saul and told him that he would die that day. And it happened. He died. Even the day of his death, he was seeking the approval of someone who had been dead for a long time. We've got to move beyond the expectations of people. We've got to move beyond the addiction to get other people's attention. And it doesn't always happen the same way. It doesn't necessarily happen outside the church or inside the church. It happens all across both. You might have been doing something, ministering in your class, and your class is doing well, and your class is growing. The enemy will take that right there and say, look at how good you're doing. And then you begin to take your eyes off. That's what happened. That was the problem with Saul. Saul stopped listening to Samuel, who was the prophet in his life, and he began to take on all of this acceptance from the people. And what happened, eventually the crowd would turn on somebody else. There's somebody younger, there's somebody more attractive, there's somebody more qualified, there's somebody a little bit better. And Saul had a problem with that because there's not been anybody else. I'm the only king that we've ever had. Why are they looking to this kid, this snot-nosed kid? And he couldn't stand somebody else getting that acceptance. Understanding how loved you are by God is the bigger picture. There's a Catholic priest, he ended up passing on here a while back, but his name is Henri Nouwen. And it looks like his name is spelled Henry, but it's Henri, Henri Nouwen. And he talks about the rejecting the world's upward mobility, and the way to get into the presence of God, the way to true greatness is through the downward descent of serving like Jesus did. He said this in one of his books. One of the great tragedies of our life is that we keep forgetting who we are. One of the great tragedies of life is that we forget that we are so loved that Jesus laid down his life for us. We make that transition from Saul to David in our acceptance of God's love for us. And then we are immediately bombarded with other voices trying to pull us in the other direction. We are immediately bombarded with nope, come back. Nope, somebody else is getting the attention. Somebody else is, or maybe it's not, we're to the point where Saul was with David, but we're just craving more. I've got to get more. You know what? This feels good. I'm getting some recognition. I need some more of that. I want people to recognize me. I want people to know what's going on. How do we find our place? How do we get back to that place with God? We remember where David was when he was in obscurity. We remember where David was when he was out into the field and he was nothing but him and God. Nothing but him and God and the music that God would flow through him. And we need to get back and we need to find that once more. We need to go back and find where our audience really is. That audience is an audience of one. He was just a shepherd before he was a king. There was no crowd, no choir. When David learned to sing, just a shepherd in the wilderness, pleased to sing a song for an audience of one. He would sing when no one listened. He would sing when no one hears. He'd sing because he knew his song would always find God's ear. When it seemed he was alone and all was gone. When he had nothing but his song, there'd be an audience of one. I've been in the darkness, I've been all alone, and I can't see what lies before me. I can't see which way to go. 'Cause when I sing by faith and not by sight, and I hope he hears my song, he's never failed to be my audience of one. And I will sing when no one listens. I will sing when no one hears. I'll sing because I know my song will always find God's ear. When it seems I am alone and all is gone. if I have nothing but my song, I will sing when no one listens. I will sing when no one hears. I'll sing because I know my song will always find God's ear. When it seems I am alone and all is gone, when I have nothing but my song, He'll be my audience of one. When I have nothing but my song, He'll be my audience of one. The acceptance. You see, I have to sing that song to myself. A lot of times I'll speak from places where I know that God is speaking something to someone. It may be something, I struggled with that in the very beginning of my ministry. I was like, God, I was a good kid. My testimony doesn't look like other people's. I can't get up here and proclaim about how God delivered me from drug addiction. I can't get up here and talk about how I was on my way to hell because of alcoholism and God rescued me out of that. None of that's part of my testimony. And I struggled with that for the longest time because how could I be effective? And God reminded me, boy, you got a lot that I've delivered you from. And no, it doesn't look like somebody else's, but that's not your testimony. And so when I get into places like that, there are times when I'll speak and it's something that I haven't dealt with. There's times when I'll deliver a message and it's somewhere that I'm trusting that God has this word for this specific person because I've never been there. But today, that addiction of acceptance, I'm going to tell you what, that was my drug of choice. The praise and the adoration and the love of other people, I mainlined it. I got to the point in ministry where when I was in youth ministry, I started at smaller churches and I got to bigger churches and I thought that was, oh, look at what God is doing in my life. I'm at a bigger church. I'm at a better church. Oh, look what God is doing. I was rolling it up and snorting it. Every little bit of acceptance from other people that I could get. I became arrogant in what I was doing because I just wanted people, oh, yes, just, oh, it's not me, it's God. And it was fake. Until I had to be broken. And I had to come to the realization that the love of people would fail me, but the love of God will never fail me. I have to sing that song to myself because that's the only audience that matters today. That's the only thing that I have to seek their approval. Here on earth, there are some people whose approval I desire. I want my wife to be happy with me. I want my children to be pleased with me. But should it come a day, and it's not going to, but should it come a day that they choose to reject God, I would have to choose God over them. They know that. And I'm thankful that they have a relationship with God that's never going to happen. But their approval, as important as it is to me, has to come after God's approval. It has to be number one. He's my audience of one. And if it means reminding myself to go out into obscurity, if it means reminding myself to go to the place where nobody knows me, where nobody can see me, and get into that place of worship with God and remind myself that I'll turn into Saul if I allow myself to get my eyes off of the one whose approval matters more than anything else. Will you stand? I was elected to certain boards within the Church of God. I was elected to city council. Oh, man, right here. I was elected mayor of a city. Woo! That one was good. That one kept me going for a while. Until that began to fail me too. People will never be enough. It has to be God. Only He's enough to satisfy. Only He is enough to sustain. Only He is enough to bring you up out of it. And don't get to the place. Here's where it becomes very easy for the devil to sneak in. When we begin to think, oh, I'm above that. Oh, the devil doesn't tempt me like that anymore because I'm at this level. My class is doing well. My ministry is doing well. In my job, I'm doing well. And God has blessed me so much that I'm just above that. As long as you're here on earth, you are still subject to the temptation of the prince of this world, who is our enemy, who is seeking like a lion whom he may devour. When we will be called up out of this earth is when we will finally have achieved the place where temptation will no longer be there. So even those within the church, even the elect, will be deceived. Don't allow yourself to fall into that trap of seeking other people's approval. Well, I have to look this way because so-and-so expects me to. I have to act this way. We're drifting into Saul's armor here. I need to perform this way because that's what people think. No, it's not about the expectations of other people. It's about getting in obscurity. It's about connecting with the heart of the audience of one. This morning, if you need that, we prayed for needs earlier, but I wanted to have a time of prayer as we begin to move into this altar time. And if you need to step out of that addiction, whether it's the addiction to the acceptance of others, maybe it's an actual chemical addiction or a physical addiction to something, and you need to step out and be delivered from that today. The prayer team will meet you down front, and we will pray with you, and we will see God minister in you, and you will become like David, who knew the heart of God. You seek the heart of God. See, Saul sought God's hand. Saul wanted God's provision. He wanted God to do the things. He placed him on the throne, and he wanted to see him work and move, and there were battles that God had helped them be victorious in. So God's hand, the blessing, was on Saul, and he wanted to continue to see it. David didn't care about that. All of the other things came to David because he sought God's face, not his hand. One thing that I desire, and that will I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That's what David wanted. One thing. Of all the things in the world, and David was the king. He had multiple wives, money, he had everything. What do you want, David? This one thing I desire, and that I shall seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I just want to be in his presence. I don't want his stuff. I don't want his hand. I don't want all the good things that come along with it. I just want his face. Because if I can see his face, that satisfies me more than any of this other stuff. That's better than all the stuff that's ever been made, is looking into the face of the one who created you and looks down and says, I love you. I sent my son to die for you. I sent my spirit to dwell within you so that we could be together. I want you. Father, we want you today. More than anything else. More than your provision. God, we do want to experience your healing. We do want to experience your deliverance. But it's not your works that should draw us to you, God. We want to seek your face. We want to know you. We want to know you, Jesus, in the power of your resurrection and in the fellowship of your suffering, that we may know you. God, bring us to that place in you that goes beyond what most people are just, this surface level. We want to go deeper than that, God. We want to go deeper with you. You're calling us deeper. You're calling us into that relationship with you that brings us into that place of acceptance in who you are and who you've created us to be and how you love us, that satisfies our soul in the deepest areas. That longing that we can never see satisfied. Nothing on this earth will satisfy it. Not a chemical, not a drink, not a cheesecake. Nothing will satisfy like you. So we seek your face today, God, in the name of Jesus. So now, church, may you seek his face and not his hand. May you find your acceptance in who he says you are, not in the expectations of other people. May you dive deep, because that's where he has you. May you realize that, same as David said, that there's nowhere you can go that will escape his presence. And may he meet you in your place of need and give you peace. The peace that passes all understanding. May it guard your hearts and minds through Jesus, who taught us to pray together, saying, Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen and amen. It's so good to see you here.